Hey folks, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into some of the most bizarre courtrooms in history, where justice wasn't just blind, it was literally dreaming. We're talking about judges who made life and death decisions based on what they saw while they were fast asleep. I know, sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? So before you settle in for the night, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these strange historical dream stories. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how these weird dream tailies travel across the globe while people are trying to drift off to sleep. And hey, if you find yourself nodding off halfway through, that's totally fine. That's kind of the whole point here. Though I have to warn you, some of these stories might just give you some interesting dreams of your own tonight. You know, there's something both terrifying and fascinating about the idea that someone's fate could be decided by another person's dream. Like, imagine standing trial and the judge goes, "Well, I had this really vivid dream last night, so ... guilty." It sounds absurd to us now, but throughout history, this actually happened more than you'd think. Anyway, let's start with what might be the strangest case of dream justice I've ever come across. So picture this, it's 420 BCE in Athens, and there's this judge named Aristides who's become known throughout the city for something pretty unusual. The guy claims he receives divine guidance through his dreams about every single case that comes before him. And here's the kicker, people actually believe him. Now imagine you're a defendant in ancient Athens. You walk into this marble courthouse, probably sweating in your toga. And yes, I've always wondered about that. Like, do togas breathe? Is there airflow? It seems like you'd just be wrapped in a linen sauna all day. But anyway, you're standing there in your potentially uncomfortable ancient garment, and this judge looks at you and goes, "Funny thing, Zeus visited me in my sleep last night and he had some thoughts about your case." I mean, what do you even say to that? Your Honor, did Zeus happen to mention if he's familiar with contract law? Aristides wasn't some fringe mystic operating out of a cave somewhere. This was a respected member of Athenian society, appointed to one of the most important judicial positions in the city. He'd been a successful merchant before becoming a judge, had served in the military, owned property. Basically, he was the ancient Greek equivalent of someone who'd be on the country club board and the city council at the same time. But around 422 BCE, something changed. Aristides started having these incredibly vivid dreams that he claimed were messages from the gods about the cases he was judging. At first, he kept it to himself. His personal writings, discovered centuries later, show he was initially skeptical of his own experiences. He wrote, "I fear my mind plays tricks upon me, yet these visions feel more real than waking sight." The first case where he publicly acknowledged divine dream guidance involved a pottery maker accused of stealing clay from a rival's workshop. This might sound like small-time crime to us, but in ancient Athens, craft guilds were serious business. Stealing another artisan's materials could result in banishment from the profession, which was basically economic death. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Someone had been taking clay from Nicias, the potter's workshop, at night, leaving behind footprints and tool marks. The accused, a younger potter named Cleomenes, had recently started producing work that was remarkably similar in quality to Nicias's pieces. But there were no witnesses, no direct evidence, just suspicion and circumstance. The trial had been going on for 3 days, with witnesses testifying about footprint sizes, tool marks, clay composition, all the ancient Greek equivalent of forensic evidence. Aristides listened to everything, asked his questions, examined the evidence. But he couldn't make a definitive determination based on what he'd heard. That night, he performed what he later described as a ritual of judicial seeking. He purified himself in the traditional manner, made offerings to Athena and Zeus, and then slept in his own home but on a simple mat on the floor rather than his usual bed, a gesture of humility before the gods. In his dream, Aristides found himself standing in a potter's workshop at night, watching two figures moving around in the darkness. But here's where it gets weird. The figures weren't people. They were large clay vessels walking around on little pottery feet, handling tools with ceramic arms. One vessel was well-formed and smooth, while the other was cracked and rough. The cracked vessel kept trying to take clay from the smooth vessel's workspace, but every time it touched the clay, its cracks would spread and pieces would fall off. Meanwhile, the smooth vessel just continued working peacefully, creating beautiful pieces that glowed with an inner light. Then, in the dream, the god Hephaestus appeared, the divine patron of craftsmen. He pointed to the cracked vessel and said, "Envy cracks the soul before it breaks the law." But then he pointed to the smooth vessel and added, "Yet skill borrowed with permission becomes knowledge shared." When Aristides woke up, he claimed he understood the dream's message immediately. The next day in court, instead of delivering a simple guilty or not guilty verdict, he announced something unprecedented. He declared that Cleomenes had indeed been taking clay from Nicias's workshop, but he wasn't doing it out of malice or greed. He was doing it because he was struggling with his own clay quality and was too proud to ask for help. Here's where Aristides' interpretation gets really interesting. Instead of punishment, he ordered Cleomenes to work as Nicias's apprentice for 6 months, learning proper clay preparation techniques. In return, Nicias would receive a portion of Cleomenes' future profits until the value of the stolen clay was repaid with interest. The courtroom erupted. Nothing like this had ever been done before. Athenian law was pretty straightforward. You were either guilty and punished or innocent and released. This weird hybrid solution of apprenticeship and profit sharing was completely unprecedented. But then Cleomenes stood up and confessed. He broke down crying and admitted that, yes, he had been stealing clay, but exactly for the reasons Aristides had stated. He was struggling with his craft, his family was depending on his success, and his pride had prevented him from asking for help. He'd been secretly studying Nicias's techniques by working with his clay at night. The confession vindicated Aristides' dream interpretation, but it also set a precedent that would change Athenian legal practice. Word of the divine judgment spread throughout the city, and soon other judges were requesting that Aristides share his dream interpretation techniques. The most famous case involved a merchant accused of cheating customers with watered-down wine. This was serious business back then, like potentially exile-level serious. Wine was not just a beverage. It was a crucial part of religious ceremonies, social customs, and trade relationships. Adulterating wine was considered almost a form of sacrilege. The merchant, a guy named Demosthenes, not the famous orator, just someone with the same name, swore he was innocent. He brought character witnesses, showed his wine-making equipment, even offered to drink his own wine in court to prove its purity. But 3 separate customers had complained about watered-down wine, and they all identified Demosthenes as the seller. Aristides went through his judicial dream ritual again, but this time something different happened. Instead of one symbolic dream, he had what he described as a divine series, 3 connected dreams on 3 consecutive nights. In the first dream, he saw Dionysus, the god of wine, weeping. His tears fell into wine amphoras, but instead of diluting the wine, the tears made it stronger and more pure. Dionysus spoke to Aristides. Truth mixed with lies becomes neither truth nor lie, but poison. The second dream showed Demosthenes in his shop, but there were 2 versions of him, one working honestly during the day, another sneaking around at night. The nighttime Demosthenes was adding water to wine amphoras, but every time he did, the wine turned into a muddy, foul-smelling liquid. The third dream was the strangest. Aristides saw 3 ghostly customers standing in Demosthenes' shop, but they weren't complaining about watered wine. They were arguing with each other about something completely different, a gambling debt. In the dream, the customers kept changing their story, first saying they'd been cheated at dice, then claiming they'd been overcharged for wine, then saying they'd been sold bad olive oil. When Aristides woke up from the third dream, he realized something that hadn't occurred to him during the trial. He requested that the court reconvene, and he asked the 3 complaining customers a simple question. Have you gentlemen had any business dealings with each other outside of wine purchases? It turned out that all 3 customers were involved in an illegal gambling operation that Demosthenes had refused to join. They tried to pressure him into providing free wine for their gambling parties, and when he refused, they conspired to ruin his reputation with false accusations. Demosthenes was cleared of all charges, and the three false accusers were prosecuted for perjury. But the case established Aristides as something more than just a judge who had lucky dreams. People began to believe he had genuine divine insight into human nature and hidden motivations. The really bizarre thing is that Aristides kept detailed records of his judicial dreams. These weren't just quick notes. He wrote elaborate descriptions of every symbol, every divine figure, every detail he could remember. Historians found inscriptions where he recorded not just the dreams, but his interpretation process and how they related to his verdicts. He developed what was essentially a judicial dream interpretation system. Certain symbols always meant specific things. Cracked pottery indicated envy or hidden damage. Clear water represented truth. Muddy water meant deception. Wine represented the essence of character. Olive oil symbolized prosperity or greed, and so on. Can you imagine living in a society where your fate could be decided by someone else's REM cycle? Like, sorry sir, the judge had too much cheese before bed and dreamed you were a centaur. So we're sentencing you to gallop around the marketplace for a week. But here's what's really fascinating. Aristides' dream-based verdicts had an incredibly low appeal rate. In a legal system where losing parties routinely appealed to higher courts, very few people challenged his decisions. Whether that was because his dreams were genuinely insightful or because people were afraid to argue with divine judgment, his verdicts seemed to satisfy almost everyone involved. His reputation grew to the point where people from other Greek city-states would travel to Athens specifically to have their cases heard by the oracle judge. This created a weird situation where Athens was essentially exporting divine justice as a form of soft diplomacy. The strangest part of Aristides' story is how it ended. Around 419 BCE, he stopped having judicial dreams entirely. One day, he just announced that the gods were no longer speaking to him in his sleep, and he resumed making decisions based purely on evidence and law. His personal writings from this period show he was devastated by the loss of what he'd come to see as his divine gift. He wrote, "I am as a sailor whose guiding star has vanished from the sky. I know not whether I have displeased the gods or if they simply have no more need of my service." Aristides continued serving as a judge for another 5 years, but his purely legal decisions, while competent, lacked the innovative creativity of his dream-guided period. He eventually retired and spent his final years writing a comprehensive guide to dream interpretation for future judges, though there's no record of anyone successfully replicating his methods. The legacy of Aristides raises questions that we still grapple with today. Was he accessing some kind of genuine divine insight, or was he just really good at reading people and situations? Did his dreams reveal hidden truths, or did his belief in their significance make him more careful and creative in his judicial thinking? What we know for certain is that for about 3 years, one man in ancient Athens managed to blend dreams and justice in a way that seemed to work better than conventional legal methods. Whether you attribute it to gods, psychology, or just really good luck, Aristides proved that sometimes the strangest approaches to problem solving can be surprisingly effective. Fast forward to 1692 in colonial Massachusetts. Yes, during the Salem witch trials era. But this isn't about Salem. This is about Judge Cornelius Blackwood in a small town called Millbrook. And his approach to justice was somehow even stranger than what was happening in Salem. Now, before we dive into this story, you have to understand the atmosphere in Massachusetts during 1692. The Salem witch trials were making headlines across the colonies. Paranoia was running rampant, and everyone was seeing signs of supernatural influence everywhere. It was like living in a horror movie where nobody knew who the real villains were, and frankly, a lot of innocent people were paying the price for mass hysteria. But Millbrook was different. This tiny farming community about 40 miles west of Salem had managed to avoid the witch trial madness entirely. They had their own problems, sure, crop failures, boundary disputes, the occasional accusation of someone's cow being cursed, but nothing like the mass hysteria that was consuming other towns. Judge Cornelius Blackwood had been appointed to the Millbrook court just 3 months before the Salem trials began. He was a practical man, a former ship captain who'd retired from the merchant marine after losing 2 fingers in a rope accident. The guy had sailed to the Caribbean, dealt with pirates, weathered hurricanes, and generally lived the kind of life that doesn't leave much room for supernatural nonsense. Or so everyone thought. Blackwood had this very methodical approach to justice. He'd listen to testimony, examine evidence, ask pointed questions, and then make his decisions based on facts and colonial law. The townspeople respected him because he seemed immune to the hysteria that was gripping the rest of Massachusetts. When other judges were seeing witchcraft in every sneeze and supernatural conspiracy in every barn fire, Blackwood was calmly sorting out property disputes and settling arguments about stolen chickens. But then something changed. About a month into his tenure as judge, Blackwood started having this recurring nightmare. And I mean exactly the same nightmare every single night with the precision of a Swiss watch. In the dream, he was sitting in his courtroom, the same wooden benches, the same oil lamps, even the same water stain on the ceiling from last winter's roof leak. Everything was identical to reality except for one thing. There was a woman standing in the corner of the courtroom, wearing a deep red hooded cloak that covered her face completely. The woman never spoke, never moved, never even seemed to breathe. She just stood there, pointing at whoever was on trial. Sometimes she would nod slowly, and Blackwood would wake up feeling peaceful and confident. Other times she would shake her head vigorously, and he'd wake up in a cold sweat with his heart pounding like he'd just run a mile. At first, Blackwood tried to ignore the dreams. I mean, the guy had spent years sleeping on a ship where you're constantly hearing creaking wood, wind, waves, and the occasional drunken sailor singing sea shanties at 3 a.m. He figured a recurring dream was just his mind adjusting to sleeping on solid ground after decades at sea. But the dreams persisted, night after night, with unsettling consistency. What really got to him was how the woman's reactions seemed to correlate with his own instincts about the cases. When she nodded, it was usually for defendants he felt were probably innocent. When she shook her head, it was for cases where he suspected guilt but couldn't prove it with the available evidence. After about 2 weeks of these nightly visitations, Blackwood started keeping a dream journal. He'd wake up and immediately write down every detail he could remember: what the defendant was wearing, where they were standing, how the woman had reacted, even small details like which oil lamps were lit and whether the court clerk was present in the dream. What he discovered was that the dreams were remarkably consistent in their details, but the woman's reactions varied dramatically depending on the case. It was as if his subconscious was processing information about each defendant and presenting its conclusions through this mysterious red-cloaked figure. Now here's where Blackwood's story gets really strange. Instead of dismissing these dreams as meaningless, he started to test them. Not openly. He wasn't about to announce to Puritan Massachusetts that he was making judicial decisions based on dream visions. That would have been a one-way ticket to Salem for a very unfriendly conversation about his own potential supernatural influences. But quietly, privately, he began timing his court sessions to allow for what he euphemistically called judicial contemplation periods. Court would adjourn for lunch, he'd go to his chambers, sleep for exactly 1 hour, and then return with his verdict based on whether the red-cloaked woman had nodded or shaken her head in his dream. The first case where he consciously tested this method involved a farmer accused of stealing corn from his neighbor's silo. The evidence was circumstantial, footprints near the silo that might have matched the accused man's boots, some corn kernels found in his wagon that might have come from the stolen batch, and the testimony of a neighbor who thought she'd seen someone matching his description near the silo at night. Under normal circumstances, Blackwood probably would have dismissed the case for lack of concrete evidence. But during his judicial nap, the red-cloaked woman appeared as usual, studied the defendant for what felt like an eternity, and then nodded once, firmly. Blackwood declared the farmer innocent, much to the surprise of the prosecution. But he also did something unusual. He suggested that the court investigate whether someone might be deliberately trying to frame the accused farmer. 3 days later, they discovered that the farmer's teenage son had been stealing corn to feed some wild animals he'd been secretly caring for, and he'd been using his father's boots and wagon to transport the corn, hoping to shift suspicion away from himself. The son confessed, the father was completely exonerated, and word began to spread that Judge Blackwood had some kind of uncanny ability to see through false accusations. But it was the case of the twin brothers that made Blackwood's reputation and, frankly, probably scared him more than any storm he'd weathered at sea. The case involved identical twins, Marcus and Matthias Whitmore, accused of stealing livestock from several farms around Millbrook. These guys were identical in every way. Same height, same build, same voice, even the same scar on their left hands from a childhood accident. Their own mother admitted she sometimes had trouble telling them apart. The evidence pointed to one of the brothers, but nobody could definitively say which one. Multiple witnesses had seen a Whitmore twin stealing animals, but half the witnesses pointed to Marcus and half pointed to Matthias. The brothers had alibis for each other, each claiming the other had been home during the times of the thefts, but obviously, these alibis were worthless since they were the only witnesses. The prosecution argued that both brothers must be involved since their stories supported each other. The defense argued that without being able to prove which brother was actually guilty, both should be set free. Blackwood found himself facing a legal puzzle that seemed to have no fair solution. The case had been going on for a week, with witnesses, evidence examination, and testimony that went in circles because nobody could definitively distinguish between the two defendants. Blackwood was genuinely stumped. Colonial law required proof of guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but it also held that allowing criminals to escape justice due to technicalities was a failure of the legal system. On the final day of testimony, something unprecedented happened. The brothers, apparently hoping to confuse the court even further, deliberately switched places. Marcus sat where Matthias had been sitting throughout the trial, and Matthias took Marcus's seat. They'd done this so smoothly during a brief recess that even Blackwood wasn't sure which brother was now which. Faced with this additional layer of confusion, Blackwood announced that court would recess until the following morning to allow him time for prayer and contemplation, his polite way of saying he needed his dream woman's guidance. That night's dream was different from all the others. Instead of her usual silent pointing and nodding, the red-cloaked woman actually moved. She walked across the courtroom, stood directly in front of the defendant's bench, and pointed specifically at the brother sitting on the left side. Then she shook her head so vigorously that her hood fell back slightly, revealing just a glimpse of long, dark hair before the dream ended. When Blackwood woke up, he realized he had a problem. The brothers had switched seats, so he had no idea which twin was which. But the woman had pointed specifically to the left side of the defendant's bench and indicated guilt. The next morning, Blackwood returned to court and announced his verdict in a way that surprised everyone. Instead of naming either Marcus or Matthias as guilty, he pointed directly at the brother sitting on the left side of the bench and declared that individual guilty of livestock theft. The courtroom erupted in confusion. The guilty twins' lawyer immediately objected, pointing out that the judge hadn't even identified which brother he was convicting. Blackwood calmly replied that the identity of the guilty was irrelevant. He was convicting the person sitting in that specific seat based on the evidence presented. Then something extraordinary happened. The brother on the left side of the bench, who had been Marcus originally but was now Matthias due to their seat switching, broke down completely. He confessed not only to the livestock thefts, but also to deliberately switching places with his brother, hoping to create enough confusion to escape conviction. Here's the really weird part. During the trial, Marcus had been sitting on the left side and Matthias on the right. But when they switched seats hoping to confuse the court, the actually guilty brother, Matthias, ended up sitting exactly where the dream woman had pointed. Somehow, Blackwood's mysterious dream guide had identified the real culprit even after the brothers had deliberately tried to fool the court. The townspeople were convinced Blackwood had supernatural powers. The Whitmore family was convinced he was either blessed by God or in league with the devil, depending on which family member you asked. And Blackwood himself was privately terrified by the whole experience. His journal entries from this period show a man struggling to understand what was happening to him. He wrote, "I fear I am either blessed with divine sight or cursed with madness, and I know not which prospect terrifies me more. Each night I dread sleep, yet each morning I am grateful for the wisdom it seems to bring." Word of Blackwood's uncanny judicial abilities spread throughout Massachusetts, which was both good and bad news. Good because his reputation for fairness and accuracy attracted people from other towns, who wanted their cases heard by someone who seemed immune to the hysteria affecting other courts. Bad because in 1692 Massachusetts, having supernatural abilities was not exactly a career advantage. Blackwood managed to avoid suspicion of witchcraft mainly because his dream guidance seemed to promote justice rather than chaos. The Salem trials were targeting people whose alleged supernatural powers were being used to harm others. Blackwood's abilities, whatever they were, seemed to be helping him protect the innocent and convict the guilty. But the pressure of living with these nightly visions was taking its toll. Blackwood's journal reveals that he started having the red-cloaked woman dreams even when he wasn't handling court cases. She'd appear in his dreams randomly, sometimes pointing at empty courtroom benches, sometimes just standing silently in the corner of his bedroom, sometimes nodding or shaking her head at seemingly nothing at all. He consulted with the local minister, Reverend Samuel Whitmore, no relation to the thieving twins, about whether his dreams might be divine revelation or demonic temptation. The Reverend, who had known Blackwood for years and trusted his character, suggested that God might indeed be working through him to ensure justice during these troubled times. But Reverend Whitmore also warned Blackwood to be extremely careful about how he used or discussed his dreams. The political climate in Massachusetts was such that even beneficial supernatural experiences could be misinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft, especially if they attracted too much attention from authorities in Salem or Boston. Blackwood continued using his dream guidance for judicial decisions, but he became increasingly secretive about the process. He stopped mentioning his contemplation periods and instead began scheduling court sessions, with natural breaks that allowed him time for his judicial naps without drawing attention to the practice. The method continued to work remarkably well. His court had an unusually high rate of confessions after verdicts were announced, suggesting that his dream-guided decisions were hitting close to the truth. Appeals of his decisions were rare, and when they did occur, higher courts usually upheld his verdicts. But in early 1695, something changed. Blackwood had a nightmare that was different from all his previous dreams. Instead of the usual courtroom setting with the red-cloaked woman, he found himself in what appeared to be a vast graveyard filled with headstones bearing the names of people he'd sentenced over the years. The red-cloaked woman was there, but she wasn't pointing at anyone or nodding about anything. She was digging graves, one after another, with mechanical precision. As she dug, she spoke for the first and only time in any of his dreams. Every judgment carries the weight of a soul. Some weights are too heavy for mortal shoulders. When Blackwood woke up from this dream, he was covered in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. He later wrote that he felt as if he'd been given a warning about the limits of human authority and the dangerous responsibility of making decisions that affected other people's lives based on supernatural guidance. Within a week of that final nightmare, Blackwood announced his retirement from the bench. He never revealed the specific reason for his sudden departure, telling townspeople only that he felt called to step away from judicial responsibilities and focus on other forms of community service. He spent his remaining years running a small school for local children and helping resolve minor disputes through mediation rather than formal legal processes. His journal entries from this period show a man who had found peace but remained haunted by questions about the source and meaning of his dream experiences. Blackwood died in 1704, taking the secret of his red-cloaked dream woman to his grave. His journal, discovered decades later when his house was renovated, provides the only detailed account of what might have been the strangest judicial career in colonial American history. The really fascinating question is whether Blackwood's dreams were revealing supernatural truth or just helping him access his own unconscious insights about human behavior. Either way, for about 3 years, one judge in colonial Massachusetts managed to dispense justice with an accuracy rate that was remarkable even by modern standards. Let me tell you about a 14th century Islamic judge in Damascus who took dream interpretation to a whole different level. Judge Ibn Qayyim wasn't just having random dreams. He claimed he could actually request specific guidance through his dreams by performing certain rituals before sleep. And honestly, his method was so elaborate it makes modern sleep hygiene routines look like child's play. This guy had developed this incredibly complex pre-sleep routine that would make a Broadway actor's opening night. Ritual seemed casual. We're talking about a multi-hour process that involved fasting, prayer, specific dietary requirements, particular sleeping positions, and even burning certain types of incense in precise combinations. It was like he was trying to hack the divine download system through his dreams. Ibn Qayyim served as a qadi, that's an Islamic judge, in Damascus during the reign of the Mamluk Sultanate around 1350 CE. This was during what historians call the Islamic Golden Age, when Islamic civilization was at its peak in terms of science, philosophy, law, and arts. Damascus was one of the major intellectual centers of the world, home to libraries, universities, and scholars from across the known world. But even in this environment of intellectual sophistication, Ibn Qayyim's judicial methods were considered ... unusual. Most Islamic judges relied on established legal precedent, Quranic principles, and careful reasoning to make their decisions. Ibn Qayyim did all of that too, but he added this whole extra layer of what he called divine consultation through sanctified sleep. His method wasn't something he just made up one day. According to his own extensive writings, and this guy wrote everything down, everything, his dream guidance system developed gradually over several years of legal practice. He'd started as a conventional judge, but he kept encountering cases where the law seemed inadequate to address the human complexities involved. Islamic law is incredibly detailed and sophisticated, but like any legal system, it sometimes struggled with cases where the technical legal answer didn't feel like the just or wise answer. Ibn Qayyim began to feel that he needed some kind of additional guidance to bridge the gap between legal correctness and divine justice. So he started experimenting with what he called judicial istikhara, a variation of the traditional Islamic practice of seeking divine guidance through prayer and dreams. But where regular istikhara was a simple prayer followed by sleep, Ibn Qayyim developed this elaborate ritual that took the better part of a day to complete. First, he would fast from dawn until sunset, not just from food and water, but from speaking unnecessary words, from looking at anything beautiful that might distract his mind, and even from walking on anything other than bare stone or earth. The idea was to purify not just his body, but all his sensory experiences. Then after sunset, he would perform ritual ablutions using water that had been blessed by being left overnight in the courtroom where he would hear the case. He believed that the physical space where justice was dispensed had its own spiritual significance, and that water left in that space would absorb some kind of divine legal energy. I know, it sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but this guy was completely serious about it. After the ablutions, he would pray the evening prayers in the courthouse itself, rather than at home or in a mosque. But not just regular prayers, he had developed specific supplications asking Allah for guidance about the particular case he was to judge. These prayers could go on for hours, and he would repeat certain verses of the Quran that dealt with justice, wisdom, and divine guidance. The dietary part was particularly strict. His final meal before the ritual sleep would consist only of dates, honey, and water, foods that were mentioned positively in the Quran and Hadith. No meat, no grains, no vegetables, nothing that might, in his opinion, cloud his spiritual receptivity. He believed that heavy foods would make his sleep too deep for prophetic dreams, while stimulating foods might create false visions. Then came the sleeping arrangement itself, which was probably the strangest part of the whole process. Ibn Qayyim wouldn't sleep in his own bed or even in his own home. Instead, he would sleep in the courthouse right next to the scales of justice that were used during trials. He'd spread a simple mat on the floor and position himself so that if he reached out his right hand, he could touch the scales. But it gets weirder. He would sleep facing Mecca, obviously, but he also had to position himself so that his head was pointing toward the seat where defendants sat during trials. His theory was that this would help him receive dreams that showed him the truth about the defendant's guilt or innocence. It was like he was trying to create a spiritual alignment between himself, divine justice, and the accused person. The most documented case of his dream guidance involved a dispute over inheritance between three brothers. Their father had died without a clear will, leaving behind a successful spice trading business and a considerable fortune. Each brother claimed their father had promised them the largest share, and they all had witnesses to back up their claims. Now, inheritance disputes were common in 14th century Islamic courts, and there were well-established legal procedures for handling them. But this case was particularly complex because the father had been a bit of an eccentric who'd made different promises to different sons at different times, and all the witnesses seemed to be telling the truth about what they'd heard. Under traditional Islamic inheritance law, the brothers should have split everything equally, with perhaps small adjustments based on who had contributed most to the family business. But each brother was insisting that their father had made specific promises that superseded the standard legal distribution. Ibn Qayyim spent a full week hearing testimony, examining business records, and interviewing witnesses. The more evidence he gathered, the more convinced he became that all three brothers were telling the truth about their conversations with their father, but that the father had essentially promised the same thing to all three sons without realizing the contradiction. This left Ibn Qayyim in a difficult position. He could apply standard inheritance law, which would be legally correct, but would leave all three brothers feeling that their father's specific wishes were being ignored. Or he could try to determine which brother's claim was strongest, but that would mean calling two sets of honest witnesses liars. So Ibn Qayyim decided to consult his dreams. He performed his full ritual, the fasting, the prayers, the special diet, sleeping in the courthouse next to the scales of justice. According to his detailed dream journal, what happened that night was unlike any of his previous experiences. In his dream, he found himself not in a courtroom, but in a vast spice market that seemed to stretch on for miles in every direction. The air was filled with the scents of cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, and dozens of other spices he couldn't identify. Merchants were calling out prices, customers were haggling, and there was this constant background sound of scales being balanced as goods were weighed. In the center of this enormous market, Ibn Qayyim saw the three brothers' deceased father, very much alive and apparently still in business. The father was standing behind a stall filled with the most beautiful spices Ibn Qayyim had ever seen, but he looked troubled and frustrated. As Ibn Qayyim watched, the three sons approached their father's stall, each asking to inherit different portions of the business. The father kept trying to divide his spices among the three scales on his counter, but no matter how he distributed them, the scales wouldn't balance. He'd put more spices on one scale, and the others would tip. He'd try to balance all three, and they'd start oscillating wildly. Finally, in the dream, the father threw up his hands in frustration and swept all the spices into a single container. Then he divided them into 4 equal portions. He pointed to his 3 sons and then to a group of poor children who had been standing nearby, watching the whole process. The father looked directly at Ibn Qayyim and said, "A wise merchant knows that some weights can only be balanced by sharing the burden." Then he handed equal portions to each of his 3 sons and gave the 4th portion to the poor children, saying, "Let my wealth feed both my blood and my soul." When Ibn Qayyim woke up, he was convinced he'd received divine guidance about how to resolve the inheritance dispute, but he didn't immediately announce his decision. Instead, he spent 3 more days researching Islamic legal principles about charitable giving, family obligations, and the responsibilities of inheritors. What he discovered was that there was indeed precedent for requiring inheritors to make charitable contributions when an estate was being divided, especially when the deceased had been known for charitable giving during his lifetime. The 3 brothers' father had, according to testimony, been generous to the poor during his lifetime, so requiring his inheritors to continue that tradition was legally defensible. Ibn Qayyim's verdict was revolutionary for its time. He ruled that the 3 brothers should divide the inheritance equally among themselves, but they must also contribute an equal 4th portion to charity, specifically for the care of orphan children in Damascus. The brothers were initially resistant. Nobody likes having their inheritance reduced, but when they learned about the judge's dream and its specific details about their father's charitable nature, they agreed to the arrangement. What's really remarkable is that this case became a model for inheritance disputes throughout the region. Other judges started referencing the Damascus dream solution in their own rulings. Ibn Qayyim had essentially created legal precedent based on a dream, and it was being accepted and replicated by other courts. But here's what I find most fascinating about Ibn Qayyim's approach. He developed a sophisticated system for distinguishing between different types of dreams. He wrote extensively about what he called the taxonomy of judicial dreams, identifying 5 different categories of dream experiences. First were nafs dreams, dreams that came from his own desires or fears about a case. These might reflect his personal biases or anxieties and should be ignored for judicial purposes. Second were shaitan dreams, dreams that might be demonic deceptions designed to lead him toward unjust decisions. Third were mixed dreams, dreams that contained elements of both divine guidance and personal psychology, requiring careful interpretation. Fourth were prophetic dreams, dreams that revealed hidden information about cases, like the identity of real criminals or the location of stolen goods. And fifth were wisdom dreams, dreams that didn't reveal factual information but provided insight into creative solutions to legal problems, like the inheritance case. Ibn Qayyim claimed he could usually distinguish between these different types of dreams based on their emotional content, their symbolic consistency, and how they felt when he woke up. Divine dreams, he wrote, left him feeling peaceful and confident, while personal anxiety dreams left him agitated, and potentially demonic dreams left him with a sense of unease or confusion. This classification system allowed him to use dream guidance selectively. He wouldn't base verdicts on just any dream, only on dreams that met his criteria for divine communication. It was like having a quality control system for supernatural judicial guidance. The really strange thing is that Ibn Qayyim's dream-guided decisions had an extraordinary success rate. His court records, which survived in the Damascus judicial archives, show that his verdicts were almost never appealed, and when they were appealed to higher courts, they were usually upheld. More importantly, there's evidence that his creative solutions often worked better than conventional legal remedies. The inheritance case with the charitable requirement became a model because it actually resolved the family dispute in a way that left everyone feeling their father's wishes had been respected, rather than just applying standard legal formulas. Ibn Qayyim served as a judge for over 20 years, and throughout that time, he continued to refine and develop his judicial dream methods. His writings on the subject became influential throughout the Islamic world, though most other judges were too skeptical or practical to adopt his elaborate pre-sleep rituals. What sets Ibn Qayyim apart from other dream-guided judges is how systematic and scholarly he was about the whole process. He didn't just rely on dreams. He studied them, classified them, developed theories about how they worked, and created reproducible methods for accessing them. He was essentially trying to turn divine revelation into a scholarly discipline. His final years were spent writing a comprehensive guide to judicial dream interpretation, which he hoped would allow other judges to access the same kind of guidance he'd received. The book included detailed instructions for the pre-sleep rituals, symbolic interpretation guides, and case studies of how different types of dreams had led to specific judicial decisions. But as far as historians know, no other judge ever successfully replicated Ibn Qayyim's methods. Either his techniques didn't work for anyone else, or other judges lacked the patience for his elaborate preparation rituals. Either way, when Ibn Qayyim died in 1372, his unique approach to dream-guided justice died with him. The questions raised by Ibn Qayyim's career are fascinating to think about. Was he really receiving divine guidance through his dreams, or was his elaborate ritual system just a way of forcing himself to think more carefully and creatively about difficult cases? Did the fasting, prayers, and symbolic sleeping arrangements actually open some kind of spiritual channel, or did they just create the right psychological conditions for enhanced problem solving? Whatever the explanation, there's no denying that for 2 decades, one judge in medieval Damascus managed to combine Islamic law with dream interpretation in a way that seemed to produce more creative and effective solutions than conventional legal methods alone. This one's from 16th century France, and it involves a judge who didn't just dream about his cases. He literally sleepwalked through one of his trials. Judge Francois Dubois of Reims was known for his unusual sleep patterns. And I mean unusual in ways that would probably land him in a sleep clinic today with about 15 different diagnoses. The guy apparently had what we'd now call severe sleep disorders, but back then they just thought he was touched by mysterious forces. And honestly, when you hear what happened during the case I'm about to tell you, you might start wondering if those 16th century folks were onto something. Francois Dubois came from a family of judges. His father had been a magistrate, his grandfather before him, and so on going back several generations. Judging was basically the family business, like running a bakery or a blacksmith shop, except instead of making bread or horseshoes, they made legal decisions that could ruin people's lives. No pressure there. Dubois had been appointed to the Reims Municipal Court in 1547 when he was 32 years old. For the first few years of his career, he was completely conventional, careful, methodical, and known for thoroughly reviewing cases before making decisions. The kind of judge who would read every document twice and interview every witness personally. But around 1552, something changed. Dubois started having what his contemporaries described as nocturnal agitations. He would talk in his sleep, walk around his house at night, and sometimes be found in the morning in strange places. His garden, his study, once even in his stable, apparently having had a lengthy conversation with his horse about contract law. His servants initially thought he was just stressed from work. Being a judge in 16th century France was no joke. You were dealing with everything from petty theft to heresy charges, and the political situation was constantly changing as different noble families vied for power. A little sleep-talking seemed like a reasonable response to occupational stress. But the sleepwalking episodes became more frequent and more elaborate. Dubois would get up in the middle of the night, fully dress himself in his judicial robes, and sometimes even leave his house to walk through the streets of Reims. His neighbors got used to seeing him wandering around at 2 in the morning, muttering legal arguments to himself. The really strange thing was that when people encountered sleepwalking Dubois, he would often give them legal advice that turned out to be surprisingly accurate. A merchant who met him during one of his midnight walks asked him about a contract dispute as a joke, and Dubois, while completely asleep, gave him a detailed analysis of the legal issues involved. The merchant followed the advice and won his case. Word of these nocturnal legal consultations spread through Reims, and people started deliberately seeking out sleepwalking Dubois for advice. It became this weird, informal legal clinic that operated between midnight and dawn, with an unconscious judge dispensing legal wisdom while wandering the streets in his nightclothes and judicial robes. But the case that made Dubois famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, involved a baker named Henry Montclair, accused of selling bread with sawdust mixed into the flour. This was considered serious fraud and could result in heavy fines, public humiliation, or even banishment from the Bakers' Guild, which would essentially end Montclair's career and leave his family destitute. The case had been going on for 2 weeks, which was unusually long for what seemed like a straightforward fraud charge. The prosecution had 3 customers willing to testify that Montclair's bread tasted like sawdust and had a gritty texture. They also had a sample of his flour that showed obvious wood particles when examined closely. But Montclair swore he was innocent, and his defense was compelling in its desperation. He claimed that his flour supplier had been adulterating the flour without his knowledge, and that he'd been as shocked as anyone to discover the sawdust contamination. He brought character witnesses who testified to his honesty, showed records of complaints he'd made to his supplier about flour quality, and even offered to compensate the affected customers from his own savings. The problem was that under French law at the time, ignorance wasn't necessarily a defense for fraud. If you sold contaminated food, you were responsible regardless of whether you knew about the contamination. The law was designed to protect consumers, but it could be pretty harsh on merchants who were themselves victims of dishonest suppliers. Dubois had been struggling with the case because, while the law was clear, the justice of it was murky. Montclair seemed genuinely honest and was clearly devastated by the situation. His family was already suffering financially from the loss of customers, and a guilty verdict would ruin them completely. But if Dubois let him off, it might set a precedent that other merchants could use to escape responsibility for selling bad goods. On the final night before the verdict was to be delivered, something unprecedented happened. Dubois went to bed as usual, but around midnight his servants heard him getting up and moving around his house. They assumed it was just another sleepwalking episode and didn't think much of it initially. But then they heard him leaving the house, which was unusual even for his nocturnal wanderings. Two of his servants, Pierre and Marie, decided to follow him to make sure he didn't come to harm. They thought he might be heading to the market square or the cathedral, his usual sleepwalking destinations. Instead, Dubois walked directly to the courthouse. He had the key to the building. Judges were allowed access at all hours to review documents, but the servants had never seen him go there during his sleepwalking episodes before. What happened next was so strange that both servants later testified about it under oath, and their testimonies were recorded in the court records. Dubois, still apparently fast asleep, unlocked the courthouse, went inside, lit several oil lamps, and sat in his judge's chair behind the bench. Then he began conducting a trial, complete with all the formal procedures and language. He called the court to order, even though the courtroom was completely empty. He asked for the defendant to be brought forward and waited patiently for a response that never came. Then he began questioning invisible witnesses, arguing with phantom lawyers, and reviewing evidence that existed only in his sleeping mind. The servants watched through a window as Dubois spent nearly an hour conducting this ghost trial. He would pause for responses from people who weren't there, nod as if listening to testimony, and even bang his gavel to maintain order in the empty courtroom. But here's the really remarkable part. While conducting this phantom trial, sleepwalking Dubois revealed information about the case that had never been presented in the actual courtroom proceedings. He questioned the invisible defendant about his family's financial situation, something that had been mentioned in private conversations but not during testimony. He discussed the quality of grain harvests in the region, which was relevant to flour availability but hadn't been part of the evidence. Most significantly, he asked detailed questions about the defendant's children and whether they had been going hungry lately, information that definitely hadn't been part of the trial record. Pierre and Marie later testified that sleepwalking Dubois seemed to be conducting a much more thorough investigation than had been possible during the actual court sessions. Finally, after what seemed like a complete trial proceeding, Dubois declared Montclair guilty of selling adulterated bread. But then he did something that surprised everyone, including his watching servants. Instead of the usual fine or punishment, he imposed a completely different sentence. Sleepwalking Dubois ordered the baker to bake free bread for all the poor children in the town for 1 year. Not just any bread, but high-quality bread made from the finest flour he could obtain, to be distributed every morning at the church. The sentence was to serve both as punishment for the contaminated bread and as a way to demonstrate his commitment to providing good food to the community. But the strangest part was what happened next. Still apparently asleep, Dubois began writing down his verdict and sentence in elaborate detail, including legal justifications that referenced laws and precedents that hadn't been mentioned during the actual trial. His handwriting was perfectly legible, his legal reasoning was sound, and his references were accurate. When he finished writing, sleepwalking, Dubois carefully organized his papers, extinguished the oil lamps, and walked back home, where he went to bed as if nothing had happened. Pierre and Marie followed him home, but they were too shocked to wake him up or ask questions. The next morning, when Dubois woke up, he had no memory of his nighttime courthouse visit. His servants told him what they'd witnessed, which initially made him think they were playing some kind of elaborate prank. But when they showed him the written verdict, still sitting on his desk at the courthouse, he had to confront the possibility that he'd somehow conducted and resolved the entire case while asleep. Reading his own sleepwalking notes was apparently a surreal experience for Dubois. The legal reasoning was sophisticated, the sentence was creative, and the whole document was written in his own handwriting, but he had absolutely no memory of creating it. What really got his attention was that the sleepwalking verdict included details about Montclair's situation that Dubois had somehow known intuitively but had never consciously processed. The reference to hungry children turned out to be accurate. Montclair's family had indeed been struggling to feed their kids since the contaminated bread scandal had destroyed his reputation. The mention of regional grain quality was also spot on. There had been harvest problems that year that were affecting flour supplies throughout the region, making it more likely that suppliers might resort to adulterating their products. This information hadn't been presented in court, but it was common knowledge among merchants and farmers. After reviewing his sleepwalking verdict and checking its factual accuracy, Dubois made a decision that probably took more courage than wisdom. He decided to stand by the sentence, even though he couldn't explain how he'd arrived at it. The next day in court, Dubois read out the verdict exactly as his sleeping self had written it. Montclair was found guilty, but given the unusual sentence of providing free bread to poor children rather than paying a fine or facing banishment. The courtroom reaction was mixed. The prosecution was satisfied that guilt had been established, but confused by the unorthodox sentence. The defense was relieved that Montclair wouldn't be financially ruined, but uncertain about the practical implications of the bread baking requirement, and the spectators were fascinated by the creative nature of the punishment. Montclair himself was initially stunned by the verdict, but when he understood the terms of his sentence, he actually seemed relieved. He later told people that he'd been terrified of being unable to feed his own family if he was fined heavily, and the bread baking sentence at least allowed him to continue working while making amends for the contaminated bread incident. The really interesting thing is that Dubois's sleepwalking sentence actually worked brilliantly as a practical solution. Montclair fulfilled his obligation conscientiously, baking high-quality bread for poor children every day for a full year. The daily bread distribution became a popular community event, and Montclair's reputation was gradually restored as people saw his commitment to making amends. By the end of his sentence year, Montclair had become one of the most respected bakers in Reims. His business recovered completely. His family was financially stable again, and the community had benefited from a year of charitable bread distribution. It was like the sleepwalking verdict had solved multiple problems at once: punishing the crime, helping the poor, and rehabilitating the criminal. Word of the sleepwalking sentence spread throughout France, and Dubois became something of a celebrity in legal circles. Other judges started discussing the case as an example of creative sentencing, though obviously none of them tried to replicate his unconscious judicial methods. But the experience also deeply unsettled Dubois personally. His journals from this period show a man struggling to understand what had happened to him and whether it was something he could or should try to control. He wrote, "I fear I have become a stranger to my own mind, dispensing justice through dreams and wisdom through unconsciousness." He consulted with physicians who had no explanation for his condition. He spoke with priests who were divided about whether his sleepwalking abilities were divine gifts or potentially demonic influences. He even traveled to Paris to meet with scholars who studied unusual mental phenomena, but nobody could offer him a satisfactory explanation. What really troubled Dubois was that his sleepwalking legal insights seemed to be more creative and effective than his conscious judicial reasoning. It was as if his unconscious mind had access to information and problem-solving abilities that his waking self couldn't reach. Over the following years, Dubois continued to have occasional sleepwalking episodes, but he never again conducted a full trial while asleep. Sometimes he would sleepwalk to the courthouse and review documents, or he would write legal notes in his sleep, but nothing as elaborate as the Montclair case. He served as a judge for 15 more years, and his reputation for fair and creative sentencing continued to grow. But he never publicly discussed his sleepwalking abilities, and he was careful never to base official verdicts on insights he'd gained while unconscious. Modern sleep researchers think Dubois might have been experiencing what's now called parasomnia with complex behaviors. This condition can cause people to perform elaborate activities while asleep, sometimes drawing on knowledge and skills they've developed during their waking hours. The theory is that Dubois's unconscious mind was processing all the information he'd gathered about the case, not just the formal testimony, but subtle visual cues, overheard conversations, and contextual knowledge about the community and regional conditions. His sleepwalking trial might have been his brain's way of integrating all this information into a comprehensive understanding of the situation. Whether you believe in supernatural explanations or prefer psychological ones, there's no denying that sleepwalking Dubois came up with a more creative and effective solution than conscious Dubois probably would have. Sometimes the most innovative thinking happens when our conscious minds get out of the way and let our unconscious processing take over. Let's go back to ancient Egypt, around 1350 BCE, during the reign of Akhenaten. Yes, the pharaoh who temporarily tried to convert Egypt to monotheism and was probably Tutankhamun's father. This was a time of massive religious and political upheaval, and apparently it was also when the Egyptians decided that one judge having prophetic dreams wasn't enough. They needed a whole committee of dream-guided justice. Welcome to the Dream Tribunal, an entire court system based on judicial dreams that makes everything we've talked about so far look like amateur hour. Here's how this absolutely wild system worked. Instead of one judge having dreams about cases, they had a panel of 3 priests who would all sleep in the temple overnight before major trials. Each priest would record their dreams in elaborate detail, and then a 4th priest, essentially a professional dream interpreter, would analyze all 3 dreams to determine the verdict. It was like crowdsourcing justice through REM sleep, and somehow it actually seemed to work. The Dream Tribunal was established during a period when traditional Egyptian justice was struggling with increasingly complex legal questions. Egypt in the 14th century BCI was a cosmopolitan empire with trade relationships spanning from Nubia to Mesopotamia, which meant their courts were dealing with international disputes, complex commercial law, and cases involving people from dozens of different cultures with different legal traditions. The traditional Egyptian legal system was based on Mat, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic order. But Mat was designed for a simpler world where most legal disputes were local matters, involving people who shared the same cultural understanding of right and wrong. When you're dealing with Mesopotamian merchants, Nubian traders, and Syrian diplomats all arguing about contract terms, traditional concepts of justice get complicated quickly. The Dream Tribunal was supposedly established after a particularly difficult case, involving a trade dispute that had nearly led to war with a neighboring kingdom. According to the records, the regular courts had been deadlocked for months, and the pharaoh was under pressure from his advisors to either find a resolution or prepare for military conflict. That's when a priest named Kentika approached the royal court with a proposal that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on your perspective. He suggested that since human wisdom was proving inadequate to resolve the dispute, they should consult divine wisdom through the ancient practice of temple dream incubation. Dream incubation was already established practice in Egyptian religion. People would sleep in temples hoping to receive dreams from the gods about personal problems, health issues, or important decisions. But Kentika proposed adapting this practice for legal proceedings, creating a formal system where multiple priests would receive dreams about the same case and then work together to interpret the divine guidance. The pharaoh, who was apparently getting desperate, authorized a trial run of this system. If it worked, great. If it didn't, he could always go back to preparing for war. Sometimes the most innovative solutions come from situations where conventional approaches have completely failed. The first official Dream Tribunal case involved 3 priests, Kentika himself, plus Amenhotep and Bekinkansu. These weren't just random temple priests. They were highly educated men who served as advisors to the pharaoh on religious and legal matters. Think of them as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of Supreme Court justices who also happened to be experts in dream interpretation. The case they were asked to resolve was the trade dispute that had started this whole experiment. A Mesopotamian merchant claimed that an Egyptian official had cheated him out of a shipment of cedar wood by changing the terms of their agreement after the wood had already been delivered. The Egyptian official claimed that the Mesopotamian had tried to deliver inferior wood that didn't match the specifications in their contract. Both sides had witnesses, both had documentation, and both had compelling arguments. The regular courts had spent months trying to determine who was telling the truth. But the evidence was contradictory, and the cultural differences made it difficult to evaluate the credibility of witnesses from different legal traditions. The three dream tribunal priests spent a full day preparing for their judicial sleep session. This wasn't just lying down and hoping for meaningful dreams. It was an elaborate ritual that made Ibn Qayyim's preparation routine look casual by comparison. First, they underwent ritual purification that included bathing in the Nile at dawn, fasting for 24 hours, and abstaining from speaking to anyone outside the temple complex. Then they spent hours studying the case documents, not to make a decision, but to fill their minds with all the relevant information so their dreams could process it. The temple where they slept was specially prepared for the occasion. Incense made from frankincense, myrrh, and kefi, a sacred Egyptian perfume, was burned continuously throughout the night. The priests slept on simple mats placed around a scale model of the courthouse where the original trial had been held, symbolically connecting their dreams to the legal proceedings. Each priest slept alone in a separate chamber to prevent their dreams from influencing each other. But all three chambers were connected to a central room where the fourth priest, Uzurhet the dream interpreter, would sleep. The idea was that Uzurhet would receive dreams that would help him understand and synthesize the guidance received by the other three priests. What happened that night was documented in extraordinary detail in hieroglyphic records that were discovered in the 20th century. Each priest kept a dream journal, and Uzurhet recorded his interpretation process step by step. Kentika dreamed of a golden scarab beetle flying in circles around a man who was standing in a forest of cedar trees. The beetle never landed on the man, but it also never flew away. It just kept circling, getting closer and closer, while the man tried to catch it with his hands. Every time the man reached for the beetle, some of the cedar trees would fall down, but new ones would immediately grow to replace them. Amenhotep had a completely different dream. He saw a man standing in the middle of the Nile River, but the river was flowing backwards from north to south instead of its normal south to north direction. Fish were swimming through the air above the water, and boats were sailing underneath the riverbed. The man in the river was trying to fill jars with water, but every time he dipped a jar into the backwards flowing river, it would come up filled with sand instead of water. Bakin Kansu's dream was the strangest of all. He saw a collection of valuable objects, gold cups, silver jewelry, carved wooden boxes, rolls of papyrus, but they kept transforming into different objects. A golden cup would become a cedar log, which would become a scroll, which would become a scarab beetle, which would become a cup again. The transformation was continuous and hypnotic, and throughout the dream, Bakin Kansu kept trying to grab one of the objects to stop the transformation, but his hands would pass right through them as if they were made of light. Uzurhet, the interpreter priest, had his own dream that was supposed to help him understand the other three dreams. In his dream, he was standing in the Hall of Two Truths, the legendary courtroom where Osiris judged the souls of the dead. But instead of one set of scales for weighing hearts against the feather of Mat, there were three scales, and each scale was weighing different objects against different feathers. The first scale was weighing a scarab beetle against a white feather. The second was weighing flowing water against a black feather. And the third was weighing a piece of cedar wood against a golden feather. None of the scales would balance, but Osiris kept adjusting the weights, adding and removing small objects until finally all three scales balanced simultaneously. When the four priests met the next morning to discuss their dreams, Uzurhet spent an entire day analyzing the symbolism according to traditional Egyptian dream interpretation principles. The process was incredibly sophisticated. They had professional dream interpretation manuals that were as detailed and systematic as modern psychology textbooks. The circling scarab in Kendika's dream was interpreted as indicating guilt that wouldn't rest. The scarab represented the guilty party's conscience, circling around them but never allowing them to find peace. The falling and regrowing cedar trees suggested that the truth about the cedar wood was being obscured and revealed repeatedly, but the real facts were always there to be discovered. The backwards flowing river in Amenhotep's dream indicated that the natural order had been disrupted by someone's deception. The fish swimming in the air and boats sailing underground suggested that normal reality had been turned upside down by lies and false testimony. The jars filling with sand instead of water meant that someone was getting worthless substitutes instead of the valuable things they had been promised. The transforming objects in Bakenkans's dream were interpreted as meaning that the disputed goods were not what they appeared to be. The continuous transformation suggested ongoing deception, while the dreamer's inability to grasp the objects indicated that the truth was elusive but not impossible to discover. Usurp's dream of the three scales balancing simultaneously was seen as divine guidance about how to resolve the case. The different colored feathers suggested that different types of truth were being weighed: white for pure honesty, black for hidden deception, and gold for justice that benefits everyone involved. Based on this dream analysis, the Dream Tribunal reached a verdict that was more complex and nuanced than anyone had expected. They declared that both the Mesopotamian merchant and the Egyptian official were partially guilty of deception, but that neither had intended to cheat the other maliciously. According to the tribunal's interpretation, the Mesopotamian merchant had indeed delivered cedar wood that was of somewhat lower quality than specified in the original contract, but he had done so because his suppliers had cheated him, and he was trying to fulfill his obligations despite receiving inferior materials himself. The Egyptian official had indeed changed some of the contract terms after delivery, but he had done so because he genuinely believed the delivered wood didn't meet the agreed specifications, and he was trying to negotiate a fair resolution rather than simply rejecting the shipment. The solution the Dream Tribunal proposed was revolutionary for its time. Instead of declaring one party guilty and the other innocent, they created what was essentially an ancient version of a settlement agreement. The Mesopotamian merchant would provide additional cedar wood to make up for the quality shortfall, but at his cost, not at his profit. The Egyptian official would pay a bonus for the extra wood, but less than the full market price, acknowledging that the original delivery had been partially defective. Both parties would also contribute to a fund that would be used to establish better quality control procedures for future international trade agreements, preventing similar disputes in the future. The most remarkable thing about this resolution was that both parties agreed to it immediately. The Mesopotamian merchant said it felt fair and acknowledged his own role in the problem. The Egyptian official said it addressed his concerns while recognizing that he had perhaps been too rigid in his interpretation of the contract terms. The success of this first Dream Tribunal case led to the system being institutionalized throughout the Egyptian legal system. For the next several decades, major cases that couldn't be resolved through conventional legal procedures were referred to Dream Tribunals. The record suggests that the system had about a 70% success rate in reaching verdicts that were accepted by all parties involved. That's actually higher than the success rate of many modern alternative dispute resolution systems. Whether you attribute this success to divine intervention, sophisticated group psychology, or just the fact that having multiple people sleep on a problem often leads to creative solutions, the Dream Tribunal system seemed to work better than anyone had expected. What I find most fascinating about the Egyptian approach is how systematic and professional they made the whole process. They had standardized dream interpretation manuals, formal procedures for dream incubation, quality control systems to distinguish meaningful dreams from random sleep experiences, and detailed record keeping that allowed them to track the long-term success of their dream-based verdicts. The system continued to operate until around 1300 BCE, when political changes and religious reforms under later pharaohs led to its abandonment. But for about half a century, ancient Egypt had what was probably history's most sophisticated system for incorporating dreams into legal decision-making. The Dream Tribunal raises fascinating questions about collective decision-making and the role of intuition in complex problem-solving. Even if you don't believe the priests were receiving divine messages, there's something compelling about the idea that having multiple people process the same information unconsciously might lead to better solutions than having one person analyze it consciously. Modern neuroscience has shown that sleep plays a crucial role in memory consolidation and creative problem-solving. The Egyptian priests might have been inadvertently using sleep as a tool for enhanced information processing, allowing their unconscious minds to find patterns and solutions that their conscious analysis had missed. The dream tribunal also represents one of the earliest examples of what we now call collaborative decision-making. Instead of giving absolute authority to one judge, the system distributed the decision-making process among multiple participants, each contributing their own perspective and insights. Whether the dreams were supernatural revelations or just really sophisticated psychological processing, the Dream Tribunal of ancient Egypt proved that sometimes the most innovative solutions to complex problems come from the most unexpected sources. And sometimes the best way to make difficult decisions is to sleep on them, literally. Let me tell you about something that happened in 17th century Scotland that still gives me chills when I think about it. There was this judge named Malcolm MacLeod who started having the same nightmare every single night after presiding over a witchcraft trial. And what happened to him afterward raises some seriously uncomfortable questions about guilt, justice, and whether our dreams might know things about us that our waking minds would rather ignore. Malcolm MacLeod was appointed to the regional court in Inverness in 1665, right in the middle of what historians now call the Great Scottish Witch Hunt. This was a period when Scotland was absolutely obsessed with rooting out witchcraft, and judges were under enormous pressure to find people guilty of supernatural crimes. The political and religious climate was such that being lenient on accused witches could make you suspect of witchcraft yourself. MacLeod came from a family of Highland warriors. His grandfather had fought at the Battle of Culloden. His father had been a clan chieftain before becoming a magistrate. These were tough, practical men who didn't generally believe in supernatural nonsense unless it was staring them directly in the face with fangs and glowing eyes. But the witch trial atmosphere was getting to everyone, even hardened Highland veterans. MacLeod had already presided over 6 witchcraft cases in his first 2 years as judge, and he'd sentenced 4 people to death by burning. At the time, he'd felt confident these were the right decisions. The evidence had seemed clear. The confessions had been obtained according to legal procedure, and the community had supported the verdicts. The case that changed everything involved a woman named Morag Campbell, accused of using dark magic to cause the death of several children in a nearby village. The evidence against her was typical for witchcraft trials of that era: suspicious timing of deaths after arguments with the accused, unusual behavior of animals in her presence, and testimony from neighbors about strange lights and sounds coming from her cottage at night. What made this case different was that Campbell maintained her innocence even under torture, which was extremely unusual. Most accused witches would eventually confess to something, if only to stop the pain. But Campbell insisted, even as she was being subjected to increasingly severe interrogation methods, that she was a devout Christian woman who had never practiced any form of magic. MacLeod found himself in a difficult position. The evidence was circumstantial but consistent with witchcraft as it was understood at the time. The community was demanding justice for the dead children. His superiors expected him to find Campbell guilty. Acquitting an accused witch without a very compelling reason could damage his own reputation and career. But something about Campbell's steadfast denials, even under extreme duress, troubled MacLeod. He'd seen guilty people maintain their innocence before, but there was something different about her demeanor. She seemed genuinely confused by the accusations, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would think she was capable of harming children. Despite his doubts, MacLeod felt he had no choice but to follow the legal procedures of his time. The evidence met the standards required for witchcraft convictions. The testimony had been properly recorded, and the prescribed interrogation methods had been followed. Campbell was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning. The execution took place on a cold October morning in 1667. MacLeod, as was customary for judges in capital cases, was present to witness the sentence being carried out. Campbell was tied to a stake, surrounded by bundles of wood and dried peat, and the fire was lit according to the prescribed ritual. What happened next was something MacLeod would never forget, and something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. As the flames reached Campbell, she looked directly at MacLeod and spoke her final words. "Judge MacLeod, you have sent an innocent woman to her death. May the faces of all those you have wrongly condemned appear before you until you find the courage to speak the truth." At the time, MacLeod dismissed this as the desperate curse of a guilty woman facing divine justice. Accused witches often made dramatic final statements, and he'd heard similar threats before. He assumed Campbell was simply trying to frighten him or cast doubt on the legitimacy of his verdict. But that night, MacLeod had a dream unlike any he'd experienced before. He found himself sitting in his courtroom, but instead of the usual defendants, the dock was filled with all the people he'd sentenced to death over the years. Not just Campbell, but the other 3 people he'd condemned for witchcraft, plus several criminals he'd sentenced for murder, theft, and other capital crimes. They weren't angry or threatening in the dream. They weren't demanding revenge or cursing him. They were just staring at him in complete silence. Their faces were calm but sorrowful, and they seemed to be waiting for something, though MacLeod couldn't figure out what. The dream was so vivid that MacLeod woke up convinced it had been real. He actually got up and checked his courtroom to make sure it was empty. When he realized it had just been a dream, he assumed it was a normal stress response to the emotional difficulty of capital cases and went back to sleep. The next night, he had exactly the same dream. Same courtroom, same silent figures, same sorrowful stares. Again, he woke up feeling disturbed, but assumed it was just his mind processing the stress of his judicial responsibilities. By the 3rd night, when the identical dream occurred again, MacLeod started to worry. By the 7th night, he was becoming seriously concerned about his mental state. By the 14th night, he was barely sleeping at all, because he knew that as soon as he closed his eyes, he would find himself in that courtroom with those silent accusers. The nightmare was absolutely consistent in every detail. The same people in the same positions, wearing the same clothes they'd worn during their trials. The same lighting in the courtroom, the same arrangement of furniture, even the same water stain on the ceiling that had been there for years. The only thing that changed was MacLeod's own increasing sense of unease and guilt. What really got to him was the expression on their faces. They weren't angry or vengeful. They looked sad and disappointed, like parents who had trusted their child to do the right thing and been let down. It was worse than if they had been threatening him. Anger he could have dismissed as projection of his own fears, but this quiet sorrow felt like a judgment on his character. After 3 weeks of identical nightmares, MacLeod started making different kinds of judicial decisions. Instead of death sentences, he began imposing exile, hard labor, or public penance. His court records show a dramatic shift in sentencing patterns right around the time his nightmares started. The change wasn't subtle. It was like he'd become a completely different judge overnight. Cases that would have resulted in executions under his previous approach were now resolved with alternative punishments. He started requiring higher standards of evidence for capital crimes, questioning witnesses more carefully, and looking for ways to interpret the law that would preserve life rather than take it. Initially, people assumed MacLeod was just becoming more experienced and thoughtful as a judge. His reputation in the community actually improved. People said his punishments had become more fitting to the crimes, more focused on rehabilitation and restitution than simple retribution. But MacLeod himself was falling apart psychologically. His personal letters from this period, discovered centuries later in family archives, describe a man who was tormented not just by his nightly dreams, but by growing doubts about his previous decisions during waking hours as well. He began investigating his old cases, quietly and unofficially. He interviewed people who had known the condemned individuals, looked for evidence that might have been overlooked during the original trials, and tried to determine whether his verdicts had been justified. What he discovered was deeply disturbing. In at least 2 of the witchcraft cases, there was strong evidence that the real cause of the children's deaths might have been a contaminated water supply that affected several villages in the region. The timing of deaths that had seemed suspicious during the trials actually followed the pattern of a waterborne illness outbreak. In another case, MacLeod found evidence that the accused witch had actually been trying to help sick children with herbal remedies, and her suspicious behavior had been attempts to treat illnesses that the local physician had been unable to cure. Her confessions under torture had been completely fabricated to stop the pain. The more MacLeod investigated, the more convinced he became that he had sent innocent people to their deaths based on superstition, community hysteria, and legal procedures that were designed to produce convictions rather than discover truth. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing. MacLeod's letters described feeling like he was carrying the souls of innocent people on his conscience, and that their silent presence in his dreams was a just punishment for his failures as a judge. The nightmare finally stopped after MacLeod took an unprecedented step for a 17th century Scottish judge. He issued a public statement acknowledging that some of his previous verdicts might have been based on insufficient evidence, and that he deeply regretted any harm that might have come to innocent people as a result of his decisions. This was an incredibly brave thing to do in 1668 Scotland. Admitting error in witchcraft cases could be seen as questioning the entire legal and religious system that supported witch trials. MacLeod risked his career, his reputation, and potentially his life by making such a statement. But the night after he published his public apology, the nightmare stopped. MacLeod slept peacefully for the first time in months, and the silent figures never appeared in his dreams again. Whether you believe in supernatural justice or just think MacLeod was processing his own guilt and moral awakening, those dreams fundamentally changed how one man understood his responsibility as a judge. They forced him to confront the possibility that legal procedures, even when properly followed, might sometimes produce unjust results. MacLeod continued serving as a judge for 10 more years, but he never again sentenced anyone to death. He became known throughout Scotland as a judge who found creative alternatives to capital punishment, and his approach influenced other judges to be more careful about irreversible sentences. The really fascinating thing is that MacLeod's nightmare-induced transformation made him a better judge by any reasonable standard. His later decisions were more thoughtful, more focused on evidence, and more concerned with rehabilitation than retribution. His error rate dropped dramatically, and appeals of his verdicts became extremely rare. It's almost as if his guilty conscience, whether expressed through supernatural dreams or psychological processing, forced him to develop a more mature and responsible approach to judicial decision-making. Sometimes our worst fears about ourselves can lead us to become better people if we have the courage to face those fears honestly. In 12th century England, there was a case where a judge claimed his dreams revealed the identity of a murder witness who had been too afraid to come forward. And honestly, this story is either an incredible example of divine intervention or proof that sometimes our subconscious minds pick up on details that our conscious brains completely miss. Judge William de Clare was presiding over what seemed like an impossible murder case in the small town of Whitmore, about 60 miles north of London. A wealthy merchant named Robert Fairfax had been found stabbed to death in his shop, but there were absolutely no witnesses to the crime, or at least no witnesses willing to admit they'd seen anything. This was a big problem in medieval justice because the legal system relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. Without witnesses, you basically had no case, regardless of how obvious the guilt might seem. And in this particular case, everyone in town had theories about who might have killed Fairfax. The man had more enemies than friends, but nobody could prove anything. Fairfax had been a moneylender, which was already a profession that made you unpopular in medieval England. But he'd also been known for his harsh collection methods and his tendency to foreclose on properties when people couldn't pay their debts. Half the town owed him money, and the other half had horror stories about his business practices. The most obvious suspect was a blacksmith named Thomas Baker, whose workshop had been seized by Fairfax just 2 weeks before the murder. Baker had been publicly threatening Fairfax, telling anyone who would listen that the merchant was a bloodsucker who deserved whatever happened to him. But Baker claimed he'd been home with his family on the night of the murder, and his wife and children supported his alibi. The investigation had been going on for 3 weeks, and de Clare was getting pressure from his superiors to either solve the case or close it. A murdered merchant was bad for business, and the uncertainty was making other traders nervous about visiting Whitmore. The problem was that while everyone suspected Baker was guilty, there was no direct evidence. The murder weapon had never been found. There were no fingerprints or forensics in the 12th century, and nobody would admit to having seen Baker near Fairfax's shop on the night of the murder. De Clare had interviewed every person in town who might have witnessed something, but they all claimed to have been indoors when the murder occurred. This was suspicious because Fairfax's shop was located on the main street, right across from the tavern, which would normally have had people coming and going all evening. It felt like the entire town was engaged in a conspiracy of silence, but DeClaire couldn't figure out whether they were protecting Baker because they sympathized with him, or whether they were afraid of whoever had actually committed the murder. The case was about to be dismissed for lack of evidence when DeClaire had the strangest dream of his judicial career. He found himself standing in Fairfax's shop on the night of the murder, watching the crime unfold like some kind of invisible observer. In the dream, he could see everything clearly, the layout of the shop, the placement of furniture, even the expressions on people's faces. But most importantly, he could see something that hadn't come up during any of his investigations. There was a young girl hiding behind a baker's stall outside the shop, watching the entire murder unfold. The girl in his dream had distinctive red hair and what looked like a scar on her left hand. She was crouched down behind the stall, apparently trying to stay hidden, but she had a clear view of everything that was happening inside the shop through the open doorway. What was really strange about the dream was how specific the details were. DeClaire could see exactly what the girl was wearing, a brown wool dress with a torn sleeve, leather shoes that were too big for her feet, and a blue ribbon in her hair that had come partially untied. When DeClaire woke up from this dream, his first instinct was to dismiss it as just his mind processing the frustration of the unsolved case. But something about the dream felt different from his usual nighttime thoughts. The details were too specific, too vivid, and too consistent to feel like random dream imagery. More importantly, the girl in his dream looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. It was like having someone's name on the tip of your tongue. He was certain he'd encountered this red-haired girl somewhere in Whitmore, but he couldn't remember the circumstances. Rather than ignoring the dream, DeClaire decided to test whether it might contain any useful information. He sent town criers through Whitmore with instructions to find anyone matching the girl's description: red hair, scar on left hand, about 12 or 13 years old. This was a pretty unusual step for a medieval judge to take based on a dream, but DeClaire figured he had nothing to lose. The case was about to be closed anyway, so if his dream lead went nowhere, he'd be no worse off than before. Within a few hours, the town criers returned with information about a girl named Agnes Miller, the daughter of a baker who operated a stall in the market square, the same baker's stall that had appeared in DeClaire's dream. Agnes matched the physical description perfectly, including the scar on her left hand from a childhood accident with a bread knife. When DeClaire interviewed Agnes, she initially claimed to know nothing about the murder. But when he described some of the specific details from his dream, the torn sleeve on her dress, the oversized shoes, the partially untied blue ribbon, Agnes broke down and admitted that she had indeed witnessed the murder. Her story was both simpler and more complicated than anyone had expected. Agnes had been returning late from delivering bread to customers when she heard angry voices coming from Fairfax's shop. Curious and a little frightened, she'd hidden behind her father's stall to see what was happening. What she witnessed wasn't Thomas Baker murdering Fairfax in a rage over the foreclosure. Instead, she saw Fairfax being killed by his own business partner, a merchant named Geoffrey Blackwood, during an argument about missing money from their shared ventures. According to Agnes, Blackwood had accused Fairfax of stealing from their joint accounts, and the argument had escalated until Blackwood grabbed a knife from Fairfax's desk and stabbed him in a moment of fury. After the murder, Blackwood had arranged the scene to make it look like a robbery, taking some money and valuable items to support that theory. The reason Agnes hadn't come forward earlier was that Blackwood had seen her hiding behind the baker's stall and had threatened her and her family. He'd told her that if she said anything about what she'd witnessed, he would claim that her father had been involved in the murder and have him arrested as an accomplice. For a 12-year-old girl whose family depended on the bakery business for survival, this threat had been terrifying enough to keep her silent, even though she knew an innocent man was being suspected of the crime. Agnes's testimony led to a new investigation focused on Blackwood instead of Baker. When confronted with the eyewitness account, Blackwood initially tried to discredit Agnes as a frightened child whose testimony couldn't be trusted. But DeClaire's investigation revealed that Blackwood's alibi for the night of the murder was much weaker than Baker's had been. More importantly, when they searched Blackwood's house, they found some of the items that had been taken from Fairfax's shop after the murder, items that Blackwood claimed he'd never seen before. Faced with physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, Blackwood eventually confessed to the murder. His motive was exactly what Agnes had described. He'd been embezzling money from their business partnership, and he'd killed Fairfax to prevent the theft from being discovered. The case was resolved, Baker was cleared of suspicion, and Blackwood was executed for murder. But the really strange part was how DeClaire's dream had contained information that he had no conscious way of knowing. During the investigation, DeClaire learned that he had indeed encountered Agnes briefly on several previous occasions. She'd delivered bread to his house a few times when her father was sick. But these interactions had been so brief and routine that he had no conscious memory of her appearance or the scar on her hand. Somehow, his subconscious mind had retained details about Agnes that his conscious mind had forgotten, and his dream had connected those stored memories to the unsolved murder case in a way that revealed the hidden witness. Whether you believe DeClaire received divine guidance or just accessed his own unconscious memories, his dream-guided investigation solved a murder case that had seemed impossible to resolve through conventional means. Sometimes the most important information is hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right circumstances to bring it to consciousness. This story from colonial America involves a judge who dreamed about granting a pardon the night before he was supposed to sentence a man to hang. And what happened next challenges everything we think we know about coincidence, divine intervention, and the power of last-minute legal decisions. Judge Ezekiel Morton was about as practical and no-nonsense as colonial judges got. The guy had been a successful farmer before being appointed to the bench, and he approached legal decisions the same way he approached crop management, methodically, based on evidence with no patience for speculation or wishful thinking. Morton served the colonial court in Millfield, Connecticut, during the 1730s, a time when the legal system was still pretty harsh by modern standards. If you were convicted of murder, you hanged. If you were convicted of major theft, you might hang. If you were convicted of certain types of assault, you could potentially hang. The death penalty was used frequently, and judges were expected to apply it without sentiment when the law required it. The case that changed Morton's perspective on justice involved a man named Josiah Whitman, accused of murdering a traveling merchant during a roadside robbery. The evidence was about as clear-cut as colonial criminal. Cases got multiple witnesses had seen Whitman arguing with the merchant at a tavern. Whitman had been found with some of the merchant's belongings, and he had no alibi for the time when the murder occurred. Whitman claimed he was innocent, but his defense was weak and inconsistent. He said he'd found the merchant's belongings on the road after someone else had killed him, but he couldn't explain why he hadn't reported the discovery to authorities, or why he'd kept the items instead of trying to return them to the merchant's family. The trial lasted 3 days, which was actually quite long for a colonial murder case. Morton was thorough in his examination of witnesses and evidence, but everything pointed to Whitman's guilt. The merchant had been stabbed with a knife similar to one Whitman owned. He'd been robbed of items that were later found in Whitman's possession, and his body had been discovered on a road that Whitman was known to travel regularly. Under colonial law, the sentence for murder was mandatory death by hanging. There was no discretion involved. If you were convicted of murder, you died. Morton had already decided that Whitman was guilty based on the evidence, and he was prepared to pronounce the death sentence the following morning. Morton wasn't happy about sentencing anyone to death, but he'd done it before when the law required it. He believed that consistent application of legal penalties was necessary to maintain order in colonial society, and that judges who let personal feelings interfere with their legal duties were failing in their responsibility to the community. The night before the final sentencing, Morton went to bed expecting to sleep normally and wake up ready to pronounce Whitman's death sentence. Instead, he had the most vivid and disturbing dream of his life. In the dream, Morton found himself in his own courtroom, but it was filled with people he didn't recognize, not the usual townspeople who attended trials, but strangers dressed in clothes he'd never seen before. The lighting was different too, brighter and clearer than oil lamps could provide, and the whole scene had an otherworldly quality that made everything seem more real than reality. Morton was sitting in his judge's chair, about to pronounce sentence on Whitman, when a figure appeared in the courtroom that took his breath away. The figure was tall, dressed in white robes, and had an aura of authority that made Morton immediately understand he was in the presence of something divine. The angel, because that's what Morton was convinced it was, didn't speak at first. Instead, it pointed to Whitman and then gestured toward the courtroom door. Morton understood this to mean that Whitman should be freed, but he tried to argue with the divine messenger. In the dream, Morton explained that the evidence clearly showed Whitman's guilt, that the law required the death penalty for murder, and that failing to execute a convicted killer would undermine the entire legal system. The angel listened patiently, then finally spoke in a voice that Morton later described as being like thunder and music at the same time. The angel said, "Judge Morton, if you spare this man's life, the true killer will confess his crime within 3 days. If you take this man's life, an innocent soul will die and a guilty one will never face justice. The choice is yours, but know that divine justice sometimes requires earthly mercy." Then the angel pointed to Whitman again and added, "This man's hands have never taken a life, though his choices have brought him close to sin. Give him the chance to prove his innocence, and truth will reveal itself." The dream felt incredibly real to Morton, more real than his waking experiences. When he woke up, he was initially convinced that an actual angel had visited his bedroom, and he looked around expecting to see some physical evidence of the divine encounter. As the morning progressed and Morton became more fully awake, he started to doubt the supernatural nature of his dream. He was a practical man who didn't generally believe in divine visions, and the rational part of his mind insisted that the dream was just his subconscious processing anxiety about the death sentence. But something about the dream's specific promise stuck with him. The angel had said the real killer would confess within 3 days if Whitman's life was spared. This was testable. If Morton delayed the execution and no confession came forward, he could proceed with the hanging and chalk the dream up to wishful thinking. The problem was that delaying an execution required legal justification that Morton didn't have. Colonial law didn't recognize judicial dreams as grounds for postponing sentences, and Morton couldn't simply announce that an angel had told him to wait for a confession. Instead, Morton made a decision that was both legally creative and potentially career-ending. When court reconvened for the sentencing, he announced that he wanted to review some additional evidence that had occurred to him overnight. This was technically within his authority as a judge, though using it to delay a clear-cut death sentence was highly unusual. Morton sentenced Whitman to death as the law required, but delayed the execution by 1 week, claiming he needed time to ensure that all proper legal procedures had been followed. This gave him the 3 days the angel had mentioned, plus a few extra days in case the divine timeline was approximate. The community was surprised by the delay, but not particularly suspicious. Morton had a reputation for being thorough, so his claim that he wanted to double-check the legal procedures was plausible. Whitman was returned to jail to await execution, probably assuming that his fate had just been delayed by a few days. Morton spent the next 3 days in a state of anxious anticipation, waiting to see if his dream would prove prophetic or if he'd just delayed an inevitable execution based on supernatural nonsense. He tried to continue his normal judicial routine, but he found himself constantly watching for signs that someone might be preparing to confess to the merchant's murder. On the morning of the 4th day, 1 day past the angel's 3-day prediction, Morton was beginning to accept that his dream had been meaningless and that he should proceed with Whitman's execution. He was actually preparing the paperwork to confirm the execution date when there was a commotion outside the courthouse. A man named Samuel Crawford, a drifter who had been in the area around the time of the murder but had since moved on to a neighboring town, had walked into the courthouse and announced that he wanted to confess to killing the merchant. Crawford's confession was detailed and convincing. He described the murder scene accurately, knew details about the merchant's belongings that hadn't been made public, and his description of the crime matched the physical evidence better than the case against Whitman had. According to Crawford, he had indeed killed the merchant during a robbery, but he'd been interrupted during the crime and had fled, leaving behind some of the stolen items. Whitman had come along later, found the items on the road, and had stupidly kept them instead of reporting the discovery. Crawford said he'd been consumed by guilt for months, unable to sleep or find peace, knowing that an innocent man was about to die for his crime. He'd finally decided that he couldn't live with himself if Whitman was executed, so he'd return to confess. When Morton asked Crawford why he had decided to confess at this specific time, Crawford said he'd had a dream 3 nights earlier where he saw Whitman being hanged for his crime, and the vision had been so disturbing that he couldn't ignore his conscience any longer. Whitman was immediately released. Crawford was arrested and later executed for the murder, and the case was closed. But Morton was left with some very disturbing questions about the nature of his prophetic dream. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. The angel had said 3 days, and Crawford had made his decision to confess on the 3rd night, arriving on the 4th day. The specific promise that the real killer would come forward had been fulfilled exactly as predicted. Morton never spoke publicly about his dream, but his private journal reveals a man who was deeply shaken by the experience. He wrote, "I know not whether I was guided by divine providence or merely fortunate coincidence, but I am grateful beyond measure that I heeded what my sleeping mind revealed." The experience changed Morton's approach to judging. He became more careful about death sentences, more willing to consider alternative explanations for seemingly clear-cut cases, and more open to the possibility that legal certainty might sometimes be an illusion. Whether Morton's dream was supernatural guidance or just an incredible coincidence, it saved an innocent man's life and led to the conviction of the actual killer. Sometimes the most important legal decisions are the ones that give justice a little more time to reveal itself. This one comes from 13th century Ireland and involves a judge who claimed that animals in his dreams would give him legal advice about the cases he was hearing. I know that sounds completely insane, but stick with me here, because Judge Cormac O'Sullivan's animal dream consultations actually had a better track record than most conventional legal proceedings of his time. O'Sullivan presided over a rural court in County Cork during a period when Ireland was dealing with constant conflicts between Norman settlers and native Irish clans. The legal system was a complete mess. You had Norman law, Irish Brehon law, and various local customs all competing for authority, and nobody could agree on which rules applied to which situations. O'Sullivan had been trained in traditional Irish law, but he was constantly dealing with cases that involved people from different legal traditions who couldn't understand each other's concepts of justice. A Norman knight and an Irish farmer would have completely different ideas about property rights, inheritance, and even what constituted a crime worth punishing. The animal dream started after O'Sullivan had been struggling with a particularly complex case involving a dispute over fishing rights. 3 different parties claimed ownership of the same stretch of river, a Norman lord who said he'd been granted the land by the king, an Irish clan that claimed ancestral rights to the fishing grounds, and a monastery that insisted the river had been donated to them by a previous landowner. Each party had legal documents to support their claims, but the documents were based on different legal systems that weren't compatible with each other. O'Sullivan spent weeks trying to find a resolution that wouldn't trigger a small war between the competing claimants. The night after the final day of testimony, O'Sullivan had a dream that changed everything. In his dream, he was standing by the disputed river, but instead of people, the riverbank was populated by various animals: a wise old salmon, a territorial otter, and a patient heron, and they were having an animated discussion about the fishing rights dispute. The salmon, speaking in perfectly clear Irish Gaelic, explained that the river had supported fish for centuries before any humans had claimed it, and that the fish were the real experts on sustainable fishing practices. The otter pointed out that different species needed different parts of the river at different times, so exclusive ownership by any one group would disrupt the natural balance. The heron suggested that the humans should learn to share the resource the way animals did, taking only what they needed and leaving enough for others. When O'Sullivan woke up, he realized the dream animals had suggested a solution that none of the human parties had considered. Instead of awarding exclusive fishing rights to any one claimant, He divided the river into sections and assigned different fishing seasons to each party, ensuring that everyone got access to the resource without depleting it. The solution worked brilliantly. The Norman lord got fishing rights during spring spawning season when the catch was most valuable for trade. The Irish clan got summer fishing rights when they traditionally held their seasonal celebrations. The monastery got autumn fishing rights when they needed to preserve food for winter. And everyone agreed to leave the winter season for the fish to recover and reproduce. What started as a three-way legal battle turned into a cooperative resource management agreement that lasted for decades. But what really got O'Sullivan's attention was how practical and wise the dream animal's advice had been. It suggested a solution that none of the human participants had thought of, and it worked better than any conventional legal ruling could have. After this success, O'Sullivan started paying more attention to animals that appeared in his dreams, and he discovered that different types of animals seemed to offer different kinds of legal wisdom. Predators like wolves and hawks gave advice about criminal cases and questions of justice. Domestic animals like cattle and horses advised on property disputes and agricultural conflicts. Wild animals like deer and foxes offered insights into conflicts between different communities or cultures. The strangest case involved a dispute between two neighbors over a boundary line that had been causing problems for years. The neighbors, both stubborn Irish farmers, had been feuding over about 6 feet of land that separated their properties, and their conflict had escalated to include accusations of crop sabotage, livestock harassment, and even charges of cursing each other's families. O'Sullivan had heard testimony from both families, examined boundary stones and old documents, and interviewed every neighbor who might have knowledge about the original property lines. But the evidence was contradictory, the documentation was unclear, and both families were so entrenched in their positions that compromise seemed impossible. That night, O'Sullivan dreamed about 2 badgers who were having exactly the same argument about the boundary between their territories. The badgers were snarling at each other, digging aggressive holes along the disputed border, and generally behaving just like the human neighbors. But then a clever fox appeared in the dream and pointed out something that the badgers hadn't considered. The disputed land was actually a natural drainage area that helped prevent flooding during heavy rains. If either badger claimed exclusive ownership and modified the land for their own purposes, both territories would be damaged by water problems during the next storm season. The fox suggested that instead of fighting over ownership, the badgers should jointly maintain the drainage area as a shared benefit to both their territories. This way, neither badger would gain unfair advantage, but both would benefit from improved flood control. When O'Sullivan woke up, he realized that the disputed land between the feuding farmers was also a natural drainage area. He investigated and discovered that the 6-foot strip of land they were fighting over was actually crucial for managing rainwater runoff that affected both properties. O'Sullivan's verdict was that neither farmer should own the disputed land exclusively. Instead, they should jointly maintain it as a shared drainage system, splitting the costs and benefits equally. If either farmer wanted to make changes to the area, they would need the other's agreement to ensure that water management wasn't compromised. The farmers initially resisted this solution, each wanted to win the dispute outright rather than compromise. But when O'Sullivan explained the drainage issue and showed them how cooperation would protect both their properties from flood damage, they agreed to try the joint maintenance approach. The solution worked so well that other neighbors started asking O'Sullivan to help them resolve their own boundary disputes using similar cooperative approaches. His animal-inspired wisdom seemed to find solutions that focused on practical benefits rather than abstract legal victories. O'Sullivan's reputation for creative problem-solving spread throughout County Cork, and he became known as the judge who could resolve disputes that other courts couldn't handle. People didn't necessarily believe his claims about receiving advice from dream animals, but they couldn't argue with his results. The most documented case involved a complex inheritance dispute where a deceased merchant had left conflicting instructions about how his property should be divided among his 3 sons and 2 daughters. The family had been fighting for months, with each child claiming that their father had promised them the largest share of the inheritance. In his dream, O'Sullivan encountered a wise old Volf who was trying to divide a large territory among her grown cubs. The Volf explained that in nature, inheritance wasn't about giving equal shares to all offspring. It was about matching each individual's needs and abilities with appropriate resources. The strongest cub got the territory that required the most physical defense. The smartest cub got the area with the most complex hunting challenges. The most social cub got the territory that required cooperation with neighboring packs. Each inheritance was different, but all were appropriate to the individual's strengths and circumstances. Following this animal wisdom, O'Sullivan investigated each of the merchant's children to understand their individual needs, abilities, and circumstances. The eldest son, who had been managing the family business, inherited the commercial properties and trade relationships. The second son, who was skilled at farming, inherited the agricultural land. The third son, who was studying to become a priest, inherited a smaller cash inheritance that would support his religious education. The eldest daughter, who had been caring for elderly relatives, inherited the family house and received support for continuing her caregiving responsibilities. The younger daughter, who had shown artistic talents, inherited valuable craft tools and materials that would allow her to develop her own trade. Instead of dividing everything equally, each family member received an inheritance that matched their individual situation and potential. The family was initially skeptical of this unequal distribution, but as time passed, each person thrived with their appropriate inheritance, and the family remained united rather than resentful. O'Sullivan served as a judge for over 20 years, and throughout that time, he continued to receive what he believed was wise counsel from dream animals. Whether you think he was accessing some kind of natural wisdom or just had a really creative subconscious, his animal-inspired solutions consistently worked better than conventional legal approaches. Modern animal behaviorists have noted that many of O'Sullivan's dream animals offered advice that was consistent with actual animal behavior and natural resource management principles. Wolves do distribute territory based on individual pack members' abilities. Salmon do have sophisticated systems for sharing spawning grounds. Even domestic animals like cattle have complex social structures for managing shared resources. It's possible that O'Sullivan's dreams were drawing on his unconscious observations of animal behavior to generate insights about human cooperation and conflict resolution. Either way, his animal advisors helped him develop a more collaborative and practical approach to justice that served his community well. Let's go back to ancient Rome, where there was this absolutely fascinating practice called pona somniorum, punishment dreams, where judges would use dream interpretation not to determine guilt or innocence, but to decide what punishment would be most appropriate for convicted criminals. This wasn't some fringe practice either. During the reign of Emperor Hadrian around 120 CE, the Roman legal system officially recognized dream-guided sentencing as a legitimate judicial tool for complex criminal cases. They had professional dream interpreters working alongside judges, and the whole system was as bureaucratic and procedural as everything else the Romans did. The way it worked was that after a criminal was found guilty through normal legal proceedings, the judge would spend 3 nights in a temple dedicated to Justitia, the goddess of justice, having what they called punishment dreams about the appropriate sentence. These weren't random dreams. They were highly ritualized experiences designed to access divine guidance about how to balance justice, deterrence, and rehabilitation. The most famous practitioner of this system was Judge Marcus Aurelius Severus, not the philosopher emperor, just someone with a similar name who worked in the criminal courts of Rome. Severus became legendary for his dream-guided sentences that seemed to fit crimes so perfectly that criminals would often reform their behavior, rather than simply serve their time and return to their old ways. The case that made Severus famous involved a young patrician named Gaius Valerius, who had been convicted of repeatedly stealing from temple offerings. This was considered an incredibly serious crime in Roman culture, not just theft, but sacrilege against the gods. The standard punishment was exile or heavy fines, but Severus felt that neither option would address the underlying problem. During his 3 nights of punishment dreaming, Severus had a series of connected dreams that showed him why Valerius was stealing from temples. In the dreams, he saw Valerius as a child, watching his father make elaborate offerings to the gods, while their household slaves went hungry. He saw Valerius's confusion about why the gods needed gold and food while real people were suffering from poverty. The dreams showed that Valerius wasn't stealing for personal gain. He was stealing from temple offerings and secretly redistributing the money to poor families in Rome. His crime came from a misguided, but genuine desire to correct what he saw as an injustice in how religious offerings were used. Based on these punishment dreams, Severus imposed a sentence that was unprecedented in Roman law. Instead of exile or fines, Valerius was required to spend 2 years working directly with temple priests to develop better systems for using religious offerings to help the poor. He would learn proper procedures for charitable distribution while also understanding the religious significance of temple offerings. The sentence worked brilliantly. Valerius became an expert in Roman charitable law, helped establish several programs for using temple resources to assist needy families, and never committed another crime. He eventually became a respected advocate for social reform within the Roman legal system. But what really impressed people was how Severus's punishment. Dream had revealed the true motivation behind Valerius's crimes. The standard legal proceedings had focused on what he'd done, but the dreams had revealed why he'd done it, leading to a punishment that addressed the root cause rather than just the symptoms. Severus continued using dream-guided sentencing for the rest of his career, and his approach influenced criminal justice throughout the Roman Empire. His punishment dreams consistently produced sentences that seemed to rehabilitate criminals more effectively than conventional penalties, leading to lower recidivism rates and better outcomes for both offenders and society. The system worked so well that it remained an official part of Roman criminal procedure for over 2 centuries, until political changes and the rise of Christianity led to its abandonment. But during its peak, dream-guided punishment represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in ancient history to make criminal sentences truly serve the cause of justice rather than just social revenge. Whether you believe Severus was receiving divine guidance or just accessing sophisticated psychological insights through his dreams, his punishment visions consistently produced more effective and humane sentences than the rigid legal formulas of his time. Sometimes the best justice comes from understanding not just what people have done wrong, but why they did it and how they can be helped to do better. You know, when we look at these stories, it's easy to dismiss them as primitive superstition or medieval weirdness. But the ancient world actually had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of dreams and their potential role in decision-making that might make us reconsider our own assumptions about rational thinking and intuitive judgment. Let's start with ancient Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE, where they had what were essentially professional dream interpreters attached to their court systems. These weren't just random mystics hanging around the courthouse hoping to make a few coins. They were trained officials who studied dream symbolism like we study legal precedent today. They had to complete years of education, pass examinations, and maintain detailed records of their interpretations and their accuracy rates. The Babylonians created some of the first comprehensive dream interpretation manuals, and many of these focused specifically on judicial dreams. The Assyrian Dream Book, discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal, contains over 3,000 different dream scenarios and their legal implications. They had specific symbols for different types of crimes, standardized interpretations for various dream elements, and even quality control systems to distinguish meaningful dreams from random sleep experiences. What's really fascinating is that they distinguished between different categories of dreams based on who was having them and under what circumstances. Royal dreams required different interpretation than civilian dreams. Dreams experienced during ritual purification were considered more reliable than spontaneous dreams, and dreams about legal matters were only considered valid if the dreamer had followed specific preparation procedures. Ancient Egypt took this even further with their dream incubation temples, where judges and other officials could go to receive divine guidance through dreams. The process wasn't just sleep here and hope for the best. It involved purification rituals, specific dietary requirements, and even particular sleeping positions designed to encourage prophetic dreams. The Temple of Imhotep at Memphis had an entire wing dedicated to judicial dream incubation. Officials would spend up to a week preparing their minds and bodies for divine consultation, following procedures that were as rigorous as any modern clinical trial. They tracked success rates, documented the accuracy of dream guidance, and even had appeals processes for dreams that seemed contradictory or unclear. What strikes me as particularly sophisticated is how these ancient cultures understood that not every dream carried meaning. They had elaborate systems for distinguishing between divine messages, personal anxieties, physical discomfort, and random neural activity. The Egyptian Edwin Smith Papyrus describes different types of judicial dreams and warns against making legal decisions based on dreams that might be influenced by illness, stress, or personal bias. The Greeks had their own fascinating approach to this. Aristotle actually wrote extensively about judicial dreams in his work on sleep and sleeplessness. He was skeptical of supernatural explanations, but he believed that dreams could reveal subconscious insights that the waking mind might miss. His student Theophrastus developed what was essentially an early theory of unconscious information processing, arguing that dreams allowed judges to synthesize complex information in ways that conscious analysis couldn't achieve. Greek courts had what they called hypnos consultations, formal procedures where judges could request additional time to sleep on difficult cases. This wasn't considered lazy or indecisive. It was seen as a sophisticated judicial tool for accessing deeper wisdom. The oracle at Delphi, while primarily religious, also served judicial functions, and many of the Pythia's pronouncements were delivered after ritual dream states induced by various herbs and psychological techniques. Medieval Europe had a complicated relationship with dream-based justice because of Christian theology. On one hand, the Bible contains numerous examples of God communicating through dreams. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Daniel receiving prophetic visions, the wise men being warned in dreams not to return to Herod. These biblical precedents gave dreams a certain theological legitimacy. But the church was also deeply concerned about distinguishing divine revelation from demonic deception. This led to some incredibly sophisticated theological and psychological analysis of judicial dreams. Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about the criteria for determining whether dreams came from God, from natural psychological processes, or from evil influences. The validation procedures developed by medieval courts were remarkably thorough. A judge claiming dream guidance would have to submit their dreams to theological review, demonstrate that the dreams were consistent with Christian moral principles, and often undergo additional spiritual testing to prove they weren't under supernatural deception. Some regions developed what were called dream councils, committees of legal and religious authorities, who would collectively evaluate whether a dream-based verdict was valid. These councils kept detailed records, tracked the long-term outcomes of dream-guided decisions, and even developed statistical models for determining which types of dreams were most likely to produce just outcomes. What's really interesting is that this system of validation and quality control often led to better judicial decisions, regardless of whether you believe the dreams were supernatural. The requirement that judges think carefully about their dreams, submit them for review, and justify their interpretations forced them to be more reflective and thorough in their decision-making process. Colonial America inherited European attitudes about dreams and justice, but with some uniquely American innovations. The Puritans believed strongly in divine providence, but were also deeply suspicious of anything that might be supernatural deception, which created fascinating tensions in their legal system. Puritan courts required judges who claimed dream guidance to submit their dreams to community elders for interpretation. It wasn't enough for a judge to have a dream. The community had to agree that the dream was genuinely divine. This created a form of democratic validation that was quite different from the hierarchical systems used in Europe. Some colonial settlements kept official dream records that are absolutely fascinating to read today. The Plymouth Colony archives contain detailed accounts of judicial dreams and their outcomes, complete with community discussions about their validity and long-term follow-up on whether the dream-guided decisions had been wise. The Salem witch trials actually marked a turning point in American attitudes towards supernatural evidence, including dreams. The hysteria and false accusations made many people skeptical of any legal proceedings that relied on supernatural testimony. After Salem, American courts gradually moved away from accepting dream guidance, though the practice continued informally in some regions well into the 18th century. Now, modern sleep research has given us some fascinating insights into these historical practices that might validate some of their approaches. Even if we reject their supernatural explanations, we now know that REM sleep is when our brains consolidate information from the day, process complex problems, and sometimes discover solutions that eluded our conscious minds. The phenomenon of incubation, where people solve problems during sleep that they couldn't solve while awake, has been documented extensively in modern laboratories. Scientists have found that people who sleep on difficult decisions often make better choices than those who decide immediately, particularly for complex problems involving multiple variables and conflicting considerations. There's also the fascinating research on thin slice judgments, our ability to make surprisingly accurate assessments based on very limited information. Some psychologists think that judicial dreams might have been a way for judges to access their intuitive understanding of cases without the interference of conscious bias or social pressure. Modern neuroscience has shown that during certain sleep stages, our brains engage in what researchers call default mode processing, a state where we unconsciously synthesize information, recognize patterns, and generate creative solutions. The elaborate preparation rituals used by ancient dream judges might have been inadvertently optimizing their brains for this type of enhanced information processing. The really intriguing possibility is that some of these historical judges were accessing genuine insights about their cases, just not through supernatural means. Their dreams might have been revealing patterns they'd unconsciously noticed, connections between pieces of evidence they hadn't consciously made, or psychological insights about defendants and witnesses that their waking minds hadn't fully processed. Whether you believe in divine revelation or prefer neuroscientific explanations, there's growing evidence that the human brain continues working on problems during sleep in ways that can produce genuinely useful insights. Maybe those ancient judges were onto something after all, even if their explanations for how it worked were more supernatural than scientific. Before we drift off for the night, let me share a few lesser-known dream stories that almost nobody talks about. The kind of strange judicial cases that got buried in dusty archives and forgotten by history. Here's something most people don't know. There was actually a judge in rural Louisiana who officially used dreams in his verdicts as recently as the 1940s. Judge Thibaut Boudreau presided over a small parish court in the Bayou country, and he was known locally for what people called his night wisdom. This wasn't some backwoods superstition. Boudreau had been educated at Tulane Law School and had practiced in New Orleans before returning to his hometown to serve as a rural judge. Boudreau never claimed divine revelation or supernatural powers like the historical judges we've talked about. He simply believed that sleeping on difficult cases helped him make better decisions, and he developed a very methodical approach to what he called judicial contemplation through rest. His method was to review all the evidence before bed, then pay careful attention to any dreams he had about the case, looking for insights that his conscious analysis might have missed. The practice only came to wider attention when one of his dream-based verdicts was appealed to a higher court in 1947. The case involved a property dispute between two families that had been feuding for generations, and Boudreau's solution was so creative and effective that the appellate judges wanted to understand how he'd arrived at it. When they reviewed Boudreau's decision-making record, they discovered something remarkable. His verdicts were almost never overturned on appeal, had an unusually high satisfaction rate among all parties involved, and seemed to resolve disputes in ways that prevented future litigation between the same parties. Whether you attributed it to dreams or just really good judicial instincts, Boudreau's approach was producing exceptional results. The appellate court ultimately upheld his verdict, though they were careful not to officially endorse dream-based decision-making. Boudreau retired in 1953, and as far as anyone knows, He was the last official judge in America to openly use dreams as part of his judicial process. But then there's this absolutely bizarre case from 18th century Prussia, where there was actually a secret society of judges who shared their judicial dreams with each other. They called themselves the Nocturnal Brotherhood of Justice, which sounds like something from a Gothic novel, but they were completely serious about their dream-sharing activities. The group was discovered when one member's diary was found after his death in 1784. The diary revealed that they met monthly in a private room behind a tavern in Berlin, where they would discuss dreams they'd had about their cases and sometimes coordinate their decisions based on shared dream experiences. They had developed an elaborate system for interpreting each other's dreams and sometimes made coordinated rulings when they believed multiple dreams were pointing toward the same conclusion. What's really strange is that they seemed to believe judicial dreams were more accurate when multiple judges had similar visions about the same legal principles. It was like they were trying to create a supernatural peer review system for divine legal guidance. The Prussian authorities were not amused when they discovered this dream-sharing network. Several judges were disciplined, and the practice was officially banned throughout the kingdom. But some historians think similar unofficial networks existed in other regions, judges quietly consulting with each other about their night visions before making major decisions. And here's probably the strangest judicial dream story I've found. It involves not a judge, but an entire jury that claimed to have shared the same dream. This happened in a small town in Wales in 1876 during a trial for cattle rustling. The jury had been sequestered for 3 days and couldn't reach a unanimous decision about the defendant's guilt. On the final night of deliberations, 7 of the 12 jurors reported having nearly identical dreams about the defendant. In their shared dream, they saw him herding cattle that didn't belong to him, but he was being forced to do it by a man with a gun who was standing just out of sight behind some trees. When the jurors compared their dreams the next morning, they were amazed by the similarities. All 7 had seen the same basic scene, the defendant moving cattle under duress. The hidden gunman, even specific details like the color of the cattle and the type of trees where the gunman was hiding. Based on these shared dreams, the jury found the defendant guilty of cattle theft but recommended extreme leniency because they believed he had been coerced. The judge accepted their recommendation and sentenced the defendant to community service rather than imprisonment. Later investigation revealed that the defendant had indeed been threatened into stealing cattle by a local outlaw who had been terrorizing farmers in the region. The shared jury dreams had somehow revealed the truth about the coercion that hadn't come out during the trial testimony. Modern sleep researchers have documented cases of people having similar dreams when sleeping in the same location, possibly due to shared environmental factors like sounds, temperatures, or even electromagnetic fields. Whether the Welsh jury experienced something supernatural or just really sophisticated subconscious teamwork, their shared dreams led them to a more just verdict than they might have reached through conventional deliberation. Sometimes I wonder about these stories, whether the people in them ever realized how fascinating their dreams would be to strangers hundreds of years later. There's something kind of beautiful about that, isn't there? The most private experience we have, our dreams, somehow connecting us across time and revealing truths that our waking minds couldn't grasp. These obscure cases remind us that the boundary between sleeping and waking justice has always been blurrier than we might expect, and that sometimes the most important insights come from the most unexpected sources, if you're somehow still awake, which would honestly surprise me at this point. I hope tonight's journey through the strange world of dream-based justice has given you something fascinating to think about as you drift off to sleep. It's remarkable how throughout history, people have tried to access wisdom and guidance through their dreams, especially when facing the enormous responsibility of determining another person's fate. Whether you believe these judges were receiving divine messages, processing subconscious insights, or just getting really lucky with their nighttime revelations. There's something compelling about the idea that our sleeping minds might have access to truths that our waking selves can't see. What strikes me most about these stories is how seriously these historical figures took the responsibility of justice. They weren't just going through legal motions or applying rules. Mechanically, they were desperately seeking the best possible outcomes for the people whose lives hung in the balance of their decisions. Some of them turned to dreams because conventional legal methods weren't giving them the answers they needed to sleep peacefully at night. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Whether divine revelation or enhanced problem solving, these dream-guided judges were all trying to bridge the gap between legal correctness and true justice, between following the rules and doing what was right. Sometimes that required thinking outside the box, or in this case, thinking outside consciousness entirely. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and maybe share if you've ever had a dream that gave you clarity about a difficult decision in your own life. Not asking you to become a dream judge or anything, but sometimes our sleeping minds do seem to work things out in ways our conscious thoughts can't. And hey, if you do have any weird dreams tonight involving courtrooms, judges, or scales of justice, come back tomorrow and tell us about it in the comments. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the next person to solve a mystery through your dreams, though hopefully it'll be something less dramatic than a murder trial. Thanks for joining me on another strange trip through history's most bizarre dream stories. Sleep tight, and remember, sometimes the best decisions come when we're not even awake to make them. See you in your dreams,